Okay, hi everybody. Good morning, good morning. I hope everyone had a lovely Purim and that everyone's recovered. Oh, yeah, the other P word. Okay, Boker Tov, everyone. We're going to be studying a few minutes of the Kuzari just to bring us up to a major new section, which is paragraph 25 of essay 4. But before we get there, I think that there's an important introduction in the very last paragraph of section 23 of the fourth essay, which is on page 451 in the Kuzari. The last thing that we had discussed, when was the last time we met? Was it 2 weeks ago? 2 weeks ago, we reflected upon a story that appears in the Gemara about Rav Ashi, who was relating the story about King Menashe and about how the tremendous desire for idolatry in the ancient world was overpowering, and that we don't have a really frame of reference to appreciate how rampant the desire for idolatry was in the ancient world. We look at it today and say, like, who in their right mind would want to bow down to a statue and offer incense to a statue? That doesn't seem to appeal to us, doesn't make any sense intellectually. But yet in the ancient world, it was something that was quite predominant. And so that was really what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi wanted to point out in defense of our ancestors who, despite having accepted the Torah, were still steeped in idolatry. This is almost reminiscent of the sort of defense that the Rabbi Yehuda Halevi had made all the way back at the beginning of in section 1 when he talked about the golden calf. So that's really his role. He's the great defender of the Jewish people, and it's our role. We want to take a cue from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi to also be the defenders of the Jewish people, just like Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, used to do. That yes, the guy is smoking on Yom Kippur, but at least he has the honesty to be able to admit what he's doing, and that kind of attitude. And the last sentence of that paragraph is, if these practices, meaning idolatrous practices, were as popular today as they were then, you would see our people and the philosophers seduced by them, just as we are seduced by the other senseless practices of astrology, incantations, talismans, and other supernatural procedures, despite the Torah prohibitions involved. And the senseless, the word senseless, that's what I translated, I guess, for the word hahavalim, the she'irit hahavalim, the remnant of foolish practices. And this is going to act as a bit of an introduction to the next section when we get into a discussion of a book, a very ancient book called Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation. And hopefully you'll be able to see why once we start that section. But what I wanted to do for today is to really ponder the question, is the use of talismans, astrology, supernatural procedures, are they folly? Are they foolish practices, senseless practices, or is there something to them? And this is a very important conversation that goes on among our medieval commentaries. There's a big machlokes, a dispute between the Rambam and the Ramban as to whether there is anything to the occult, whether supernatural practices, witchcraft and things like that, we know that the Torah prohibits these practices. Me'onein u'mechashev, you're not allowed to go to a necromancer, you're not allowed to go to a fortune teller, you're not allowed to go to a witch in order to garner some kind of benefit, whether it's knowing the future or whether it's to make a love potion number 9, or whatever it is you want to get. The Torah says you're not allowed to do those things. The question is, why not? Why does the Torah prohibit us from doing those things? Rabbi Yehuda Halevi seems to say that these things are foolish practices. Now, when someone tells you that they're foolish practices, they're havalim, they're senseless or meaningless, it sounds like there's nothing to them. It's like going to a snake oil salesman and thinking that the snake oil is going to help you when it's really nothing. So that is something that I wanted to discuss with you for today, and to see that there are actually two different opinions on this matter. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at this discussion as it appears from the Rambam in Laws of Idolatry, and the counter of that is from the Ramban in his Torah commentary to Parshat Shoftim. So if you take a look at the Rambam in the Laws of Idolatry, he states as follows: Hamechashev chayav skila, that a person who practices sorcery is put to death by stoning. It's a capital offense, provided that he does actual sorcery actions that are described by the Torah. There are certain very particular practices that the Torah says, ov and yidaoni, using certain kinds of bones of dead animals and placing them in different places, is described by the Talmud. But then in the next halacha, the Rambam writes, udvarim ha'elu kulan divrei sheker v'chazav hein. All of these occult practices that the Torah describes are sheker and kazav. They are falsehood and absolute artifice. Behem shehitu bahen ovdei kochavim hakadmonim legoyei ha'aratzot. These are things that early idolaters in earlier generations deceived all of the other nations of the world. Kedei sheyinhagu achareihem. They placed intimidating practices on different nations in order to gain power. Now, it's quite interesting, isn't it? I was just having a conversation with a young man yesterday who's quite intellectual, very thoughtful, is not sure that he buys into Judaism or any religion at all, is not sure he believes in God. And his suggestion was that religious laws are imposed on people in order to be able to control them, right? Religion is the opiate of the masses, etc., right? And so, it's very difficult to engage such a person in a convincing line of argumentation against that, because we know for a fact that in world history there have been people who have exploited religious or supernatural practices, claiming that they were miracle men in order to be able to control the masses, right? So we know that has happened historically, and the Torah even warns about it, that there are going to be false prophets who are going to try and manipulate you by trying to prove their powers and perform miracles, and you shouldn't listen to them and so forth. So the Rambam basically says that all of these supernatural practices, whether they were fortune tellers, stargazers, etc., they're total frauds. And these practices were introduced to the masses in order to control them. Ve'ein ra'ui liYisrael shehem chachamim mechukamim lihimashech bahavalim elu. It is therefore not appropriate for the Jewish people who are wise and are enlightened, that's what mechukamim I think means, lihimashech bahavalim elu, to be drawn after these nonsensical practices. Notice he uses the same verbiage as Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, calls them havalim, okay? V'lo laha'alot alev sheyesh to'elet bahen, and not to even entertain the possibility that there's any benefit in these practices. Shenemar, as it says in the Torah, kilo nachash b'Yaakov v'lo kesem b'Yisrael. There does not exist within Jacob any nachash, any divination, below kesim, nor is there any sorcery among Israel. The Nemar, and it also says in the Torah, Ki hagoyim ha'ele, asher ata yoresh otam. God says, the nations that you are going to dispossess of their land when you take over Canaan, el ma'onanim ve'el kosamim yishma'u ve'ataloche. They hearken to the diviners and the sorcerers, but you may not do that. Kol hamamin bidvarim ha'ilu v'chayotze bahem, umechashev bilibo shehem emet udvar chochma. He says, there are people, if a person believes in these things and believes that there are things that can have an influence magically, right? Avol haTorah asratan einan ela min hasechalim u'michasarei hada'at. If you think that these occult practices that the Torah prohibits are substantive, but just that you're not allowed to do them because the Torah forbids them, the Rambam says you're an idiot. You're an idiot, right? He says, "Uvichlal hanashim v'haktanim she'ein datan shlema." I don't know if I should translate that. I think I will. I think I will leave that untranslated. But it's also important to understand the Rambam is a product of his time, when there was a large amount of literacy among big sections of the population, including women and children. Okay? In other words, basically they're bubba mices, the Rambam says. Why do we call something a bubba mice? But we don't say zeda mice. Okay. Anyway, that's the point he's making. Aval ba'alei ha'chochma u'temimei hada'at yedu'u birayot birurot shekol elu hadvarim. He says, truly wise people and people who have their heads on straight will know through clear demonstration shekol elu hadvarim she'asra Torah einan divrei chochma ela tohu vahevel. These are not acts of wisdom that, that the magicians of old tapped into special divine forces that we're not supposed to dabble with. He says, no, elatohu vahevel. They're absolute idiocy, folly. Shenimshuchu bahen chaserei hadat v'natshu kol darchei ha'emet biglalan. That only fools follow these practices and have uprooted all paths of truth because of that. And therefore, when the Torah exhorts us not to follow these foolish practices, it says, be tamim, which we translate alternatively as either innocent or complete with the Lord your God. Be complete, and he seems to be saying it, be complete with Hashem. Don't be an idiot. That's how he learns the commandment of tamim tihiyeh im Hashem Elokecha. Other commentaries translate it as be innocent, meaning that there may be something to those magical practices, but walk innocently after the Lord and don't try to tap into those magical forces. But the Rambam is having none of that, right? He's saying there's absolutely no validity to that. Now, this may even have halachic ramifications. There's an interesting psak of the Gemara. The Gemara says that on Shabbos, there are certain types of adornment that you're allowed to wear. Even when there's no Eruv outside, you're allowed to wear a necklace. Why are you allowed to wear a necklace on Shabbos? Because even though there are certain things that you're not allowed to wear, like let's say you're girded with a harn, what's it called? A holster for a gun. So that could be problematic if there's no Eruv, because you may have to take out your gun and use it as a weapon, and you'd be carrying, okay? Unless, of course, there's danger involved, right? So that would be an exception. But there are certain things which the Gemara says you're not allowed to wear because you may take them off and carry them. Jewelry is not one of those things. That's why even when there's no Eruv, you're allowed to wear jewelry on Shabbos. What about an amulet that's meant to ward off evil spirits? Can you wear an amulet on Shabbos and walk outside with it? So the Mishnah says, yes, you are, because we're not worried that you're going to take off the amulet on Shabbos. Why? Because you don't want to lose the special protective effect that this amulet has on your life. So the Rambam, in codifying this law, says, you all realize, of course, he says, that amulets have absolutely no real effect on one's life. But the rabbi still allowed it because when the suspicious people among us believe that they are effective and efficacious, they're not going to remove shots. So, yeah.
As far as I can see.
Well, that's exactly what the Rambam is saying. The reason why the Torah prohibits it is because you as Jews are meant to display wisdom and intelligence and sophistication. And that's exactly why the Torah prohibits it. He's precisely saying the reason why Hashem doesn't want us to follow these practices is because they demonstrate a lowbrow intellectualism and a lack of sophistication.
Any other examples where the Torah prohibits something because of those reasons? It seems to me that that's not usually the case. And I thought it was that until the time that Nevuah was stopped, there was some validity to these types of things. But when Nevuah was stopped, Zel Umaseh, these things also lost their validity. So in those days, when there was Nevuah, there was something to these types of things, and that's why people were interested in them. But nowadays, when we don't have Nevuah, the strength of these things is also
right. There is such an idea. There is such an idea like that. And we're going to get to the Ramban in just a minute, who argues very strongly against the Rambam and believes that there is efficacy to certain occult practices. And he lived in a time when there was no more Nevuah. And he still felt that there was something to this stuff. So as to your first question, can I think of anything which the Torah commands to either do it or not do it so as not to do something dumb? The Rambam would say yes. The Rambam would say that the vast majority of the mitzvahs of the Torah were designed to help keep you as a perfected individual with a high level of intellectual connection. And that's really what I'm teaching now in Moreh Nevuchim, is that the Rambam is very much of the belief that many, if not most, of the mitzvos were given to us to help perfect us intellectually. In a certain way, yeah, to make us into the people that we're destined to become. And for the Rambam, the people that we're destined to become are people of perfected intellect, knowers of Hashem, and not people who are drawn after silly things. So, just as an example, the reason why Hashem gave us korbanos is to pull us away from idolatrous practices that use animal sacrifice. That's just one example, right? But yeah, so there for the Rambam, I mean, this is Maimonidean in its consistency, right? And this is the Rambam speaking, basically saying the definition of what it means to follow the Torah is to be intellectually focused on truth and on God. And anything else that's going to detract you from that project, you should stay away from. And that's really the direction that why God gave us mitzvahs, is to direct us towards intellectual sophistication.
I thought the idea of protecting the individual is an answer that's given when we ask the question, what does it matter to Hashem if we cut the animal this way or that way? And the answer is given to perfect the individual, but to me, that always meant that you should follow what Hashem tells you to do, even if it seems like there's no rational reason.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's different ways of skinning that cat, right? In other words, the Rambam doesn't learn the Midrash that way. The Rambam understands that the Midrash really means that because the goal of the mitzvot is to perfect us intellectually, it really doesn't make a difference as far as that objective is concerned, whether you slaughter the animal from the front of the neck or the back of the neck. But Hashem needed to create a uniform practice, so he settled upon one standard practice of in the front of the neck versus not in the back of the neck. It's controversial what he writes. I readily admit that. But nonetheless, this is the Rambam being okay. So, okay, are you all with me so far? Let's take a look at the opposing opinion. The opposing opinion is that of the Ramban in Parshat Shoftim. And he writes as follows: Ve'ata da ve'havein bi'inyanei ha'keshafim. I want to try to help you understand what magic is all about. Kshafim, witchcraft, the magical acts. Ki haboreit barach ka'asher bara hakol me'ayin. When God made everything ex nihilo, out of nothing, asa ha'elyonim manhigei hatachtonim asher lamata mehen. God created a system whereby the more celestial and removed you are from the terrestrial world that we live in, the higher level of domination you have on those things that are lower. So the celestial bodies control and can manipulate the terrestrial things in this world. V'natan koach haaretz v'chol asher aleha b'kochavim uv'mazalot lefi hanhagatam u'mabatam bahem. So he says that God gave a certain level of dominion within the stars to be able to control and manipulate what's going on in this world. Kasher hu minuseh b'chochmat ha'itzdagninut. And there's even the possibility of actually gazing into the stars and seeing that connection between the stars' force and the things that are affected in this world. And this is known as astrology. The asa od al hakochavim v'hamazalot manhigim malachim v'sarim shehim nefesh lahem. But beyond just the stars, God placed angels that are the sort of the neshama of the stars that actually control and are the sentient intelligences of these stars. V'hinei hanhagatam me'eteyotam ad la'olam va'ed. Gezerat elyonim asher sam lahem. God placed a fixed correlation and power that the stars have over this world. Aval haya miniflaotav ha'atzumot shesam b'koach hamanhigim ha'elyonim darchei tumurot. One of the other things that God did is that God gave dual power within these stars, such that normally a star could cause, let's say, rainfall, but the very same star could also cause a drought. And if an individual knows how to manipulate that particular star, that celestial force, the individual could cause the very entity that normally brings rainfall, for example, to cause a stoppage of that rainfall, to cause a drought. The kochot lahamir hanagat asher lamata mehem, she'im haya mabata kochavim bifanim asher keneged haaretz tova u're'a la'aretz o la'am o la'ish, yamiru otam hapanim ha'elyonim alav lahafech b'mabat. Okay, I'm not going to get into the whole spiel, but what he basically says is that the reason why Hashem did this is because Hashem wants to be able to use the very forces of nature that he created to bring phenomena that he wishes to bring upon individuals or countries. So therefore, Hashem created multiple powers within these celestial bodies. So let's say normally a star, when it's in a certain position of the sky, brings rainfall, but Hashem deems it appropriate to bring a drought. He will turn the switch within that star to change it from rainfall to drought. And in that way, Hashem is not performing a miracle per se, but is, let's say, working within the forces of nature that he embedded when he created the world and just turning those switches on and off. Okay, that's the way the Ramban explains what's going on. But then he says, V'zeh sod and I'm skipping a few lines, V'zeh sod hakshafim v'kocham. And that's what magic is. Witchcraft is having that knowledge of where those switches in heaven are, to be able to use those celestial forces to be able to bring about certain effects. And I'm not going to continue. Let's just skip to the chase. He says, "V'rabim yitchasdu banechashim lomar she'ein bahem emet klal." There are many who piously state that there is no power to divination and to magic whatsoever. He says, and of course he's referring to the Rambam that we just quoted. Here sometimes the Ramban mentions the Rambam by name, and sometimes he just says, and there are those who, and he's using a sarcastic tone in his criticism of this opinion. With the argument of who can tell the birds in the sky what will be in the future. In other words, how can the birds possibly know? So even if a person professes to know the singing, he can decipher what the birds are singing, how could the birds possibly know what's going to happen in the future, this divination? We, however, meaning I, the Ramban, cannot deny eyewitness accounts of the efficacy of divination and witchcraft. I know too much, the Ramban says. I know that these things have power. The Rabotenu gam ken yodu bahem, and our rabbis also readily admit the efficacy of certain practices. Kemo sha'amru b've'ela shemot rabbah ki of hashamayim yolichet hakol. The rabbis commenting on the verse in Koheles, which says that the bird of the sky will carry the voice, means zeho'orei v'chachmatati arin. This refers to people who can decipher the singing or the chirping of certain kinds of birds and understand what they mean. And the birds, when they chirp, are actually communicating of things about the future that haven't happened yet. Aval yesh le'inyan hazeh sod, and instead of thinking that this is all fakery, there actually is substance to it. It's very deep. Uchuvar hodanu ki yesh lamazalot sarim yanigu otam vehem nefashot lekadurei agalgalim. As we've already explained, that every celestial body has an intelligence attached to it that helps to guide that celestial body and have it influence things that are going on in our world. These celestial forces can actually be tapped into so that people can know the future. And the birds get wind of these things, and that's how they're able to chirp things about the future. Okay? So that's the opinion of the Ramban. It's a much more extensive commentary. Those of you who have studied the Ramchal in his book Derech Hashem, he has a whole chapter on this idea of what we call theurgy in English, sort of a manipulation of the physical forces in the cosmos that already exist. And that's the opinion of the Ramban as well. So you have two schools of thought. And it seems that even though many times Rebbe Yehuda Halevi opposes the Rambam's rationalist approach, it seems by the fact that he calls certain occult practices that superstitious people of his time do, he calls them havalim. It seems in this case he's siding more with the Rambam. And that's the reason why when people are into these things like wearing the red thread on their wrist from the kever of Rachel Imenu, so the question is, so what's the correct response to those kinds of things? People who have the chamza, or people who wear amulets, or people who go to mekubalim for incantational things, or people who get holy water that was blessed by such and such a person, and they sprinkle it or drink it on a Motzei Shabbos at a certain time, right? All of these things, maybe you've heard of other things that I haven't heard of, or the lady who pours out molten lead into a teacup or reads the tea leaves, or all of these other things that very frum people do in different circles of our people. What are we supposed to make of these things? So there's two approaches. One approach is that tamim tiyeh im Hashem Elokecha, walk innocently with God. Don't try to resort to things that may help you. Rely on your mitzvahs, your tefillos, your masim tovim, and those are the things that are important to Hashem. The other approach is the Rambam, who says, don't be an idiot. Don't behave in a way that displays your lack of intellectual sophistication. So what's the defense of those people who do these practices? My opinion is when people are desperate, they do things that they hope will help no matter what. So if a person has a sick child, Rahmana litzlan, so how can you criticize someone for trying something really weird, right? In the hope that may help. The important thing, however, is to really rely on Hashem. If there are many times that people claim to be very faithful Jews, and in reality, they're not thinking about God most of the time. They're thinking about how to get something done. And if they hear, if there's this makubal, right? So that doesn't seem to be a very religious thing to do. Yeah, Esther. Yeah, the Witch of Endor. Yeah. To bring up in a seance the Neshama of Shmuel. I seem to recall the Rambam does mention it at some point, and I think he says that it was all sleight of hand. Now, there wasn't anything to it. But others say that there was substance to it. That's the same machloket that we're seeing over here. Yeah, but there is no substance to necromancy either, according to the Rambam. I just don't remember where he says it explicitly. I'd have to try to track that down. Okay. All right, so Ad Khan, we'll hold it here. Let me just see if there's anything here. Okay, very good. Linda has her hand raised. Go ahead, Linda.
Hi. So one thing is, so those things that people do, let's say like wearing a red string, why can't you just say, well, they're following the belief of the Ramban? Because he believes that you can manipulate certain things slightly for whatever reason. Then why are you saying that it's totally poo-poo? Because I mean, Ramban seems to believe in those things. Like if he hears birds chirping, why can't you believe in the red string, right? I mean, you're not believing that it's, that it's occult. It's just that it's right. Manipulating something.
You're right, Linda. I think it all depends on the attitude that a person has. If a person really believes that the thing that will protect them the most from evil spirits is their Torah, their mitzvos, their tefillah, so then I think if they want to wear a red string and they say it couldn't hurt, like some people have the attitude, right? So fine. I don't begrudge them. I don't think ill of people if they wear a red string, but and if they feel that you never know, fine.
Well, I just don't see how the Rambam. I mean, I sort of believe more the Rambam, but I don't see how you're sort of saying that Ramban's explanation has some validity, right? But the other thing I wanted to raise was in Judaism, there actually are a lot of things that, if you look at it externally, could be considered, divinity, or like even what Moshe did, right, in Egypt. You could, all those miracles, I mean, they really are, why did he do those? Those could be interpreted as divinity. How do you know the difference?
Form of divination, right? Yeah. So how do you determine when something is divination and prohibited, or when it's just superstitious activity? This is a very valid question, and it's something that is undertaken by a number of the poskim, and it's taken up in the Shulchan Aruch as well. Like, for example, what if a person avoids walking underneath a ladder? Or what if a person sees a black cat in the road and crosses over to the other side of the street? Are they guilty of lo tenachashu? of divination or trying, of that kind of superstition. Not clear, but there's a lot of discussion in the poskim. We see that Eliezer was almost guilty of divination, because which is intimated by the Rambam and by other commentaries, because basically he said, whichever girl will offer me water, that's the one who is meant. Okay, so Rachel says that was a show of good midos. That wasn't divination. All right, so okay, but that's part of the discussion, right? I may say I'm not going to walk under a ladder because who knows, someone may fall or the ladder may collapse. That's a very sound reason for not walking under a ladder. Okay, but the black cat is a little bit harder to hear, unless you think the black cat will attack you or you're fearful of animals. Okay. It could be, yeah.
Rabbi,
Yeah, yeah.
what
Yes.
about, oh, sorry, I can't hear
So
what.
I'm sorry. The Ramchal, if I'm not mistaken, does say that there's this idea of a reduction of magical powers that has occurred over the centuries. So yeah.
We're going to read about it again. They were able to see that a boy was going to be born, and that's why they said throw all the boys in the river. So
Yeah.
there was obviously something to that nuance. It wasn't just stupidity.
So it depends who you ask. If you ask the Rambam, he would
say that was also stupidity.
Yeah, perhaps. I'm not convinced that the Rambam would see that as anything different from the things that he's described here. I don't know. I can't say for sure, but based on what he writes here in the laws of Avodah Zarah, it seems like he has no patience for that. Even the Itzagnine Paro, even the Machashafim of Paro's court. Yeah, it was probably all just a sleight of hand, according to him. Yes, you know what? Let me get to the Parsha because we're running out of time. Okay, so we're going to be reading Parshas Parah this Shabbos, and we always do that this time of year. It's the third of the four special parshiot that we read, and we always read it at least a week before Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And the reason for doing that is because when the temple was standing, they would send out messengers throughout Eretz Yisrael to remind people that they had to purify themselves in time for Pesach so that they could appear in the temple to bring a Korban Pesach. And so this is a remnant of that sort of public announcement that is made throughout the land. Prepare yourselves if you've come in contact with death, make sure you purify yourselves with the ashes of the Parah Aduma, of the red heifer, which will purify you and enable you to bring your Korban Pesach, your Paschal offering in the temple on the 14th of Nisan. Okay, so that's the reason why we read Parshas Parah this time of the year. So we're going to be reading from Parshas Chukas, the special Torah reading of the Parah Aduma. And I just, in honor of Parshas Parah, I wanted to share with you something quite interesting that is related to the mitzvah of Parah Aduma. Just mute everybody. Okay, there we go. There is a portion in the Torah, in Parshas Vayera, where God informs Avraham that he's going to be destroying the city of Sodom. And Avraham turns to God and he says, God, if you could find 50 righteous people, would you spare the city? And God says, I would, but there aren't 50 people. And then the very next sentence is, Vayan Avraham Vayomar, Hinena ho'alti ledaber al Hashem. Behold, I have just either begun or desired to speak before you, Hashem. Va'anochi afar va'efer. And I am, after all, mere dust and ashes. And that's his introduction to saying, what if we could get 45 tzaddikim? Would you spare the city? And Hashem says, I would, but there ain't 45. Okay? Now, The Gemara says something interesting about Avraham's description of himself as being afar va'efer. I am but dirt and ashes. Amar Rava, bischar she'amar Avraham Avinu ve'anochi afar va'efer, in the merit that Avraham described himself as mere dirt and ashes, zachu banav lishtei mitzvot. His descendants were given 2 mitzvot, efer parah ve'afar sota. The ash of the parah aduma as a means of purification, and the dirt of the sota procedure, which is what? You take the earth from the temple floor, you mix it with water, you write God's name on a parchment, you mix it in and dissolve Hashem's name in that elixir, you give it to the sota to drink, and that will determine whether she's innocent or guilty of committing adultery. Okay? So those 2 mitzvot, one being done with ash and one being done with dirt, were given to Avraham's children because he called himself with great humility dirt and ash. Okay? And of course, it's very perplexing. What is the connection? You know, these 2 mitzvot, Parah Aduma and Sota, seem to be completely unrelated to each other. I think we would all agree. There doesn't seem to be anything having to do with them. And why is it in the context of Avraham's effort to save the people of Sodom, what is the connection between these? Okay, so I want us to try and figure this out because I think that there's an important message here. So the first thing I want us to see is the Chatam Sofer. The Chatam Sofer has an interesting commentary to the Torah. He says, Nira lefarei shahim sheikh. He says, it would seem to me the reason why Avraham called himself dirt and ashes, and by the way, some of the commentaries notice that the Gemara reverses it. Avraham said afar and afer, and here it's afer and afar. You know, the Gemara puts ash before dirt. Okay, we'll put that aside for just a minute. But he says, I'd like to explain the context here. Ki chet Sodom haya shelo lamdu me Avraham ech lahamin b'Hashem. What was the sin of the people of Sodom? They had a neighbor, Avraham, and they should have seen Avraham's righteousness and learned from it. But instead, they did the exact opposite. The gamla rabot lilmod mimenu b'mesh shenogea lebein adam lechavero tovat libo v'rov chasadav. Avraham was famous in the entire region as being a person who welcomed people into his home, who went out of his way to provide for others. That was his ministry, so to speak, and that he gathered people towards him by sharing of his wealth with others and making sure that people felt welcome and wanted. The people of Sodom should have learned from Avraham, but instead they did the exact opposite. And they rejected visitors. They were not hospitable to others, as we all know the story of the people of Sodom. They had eyes, they had the capacity to learn, but they refused to. And that was their sin. מאדם גדול ומפורסם, ראוי ונכון ללמוד ולקח מוסר. So the Chatam Sofer says, Avraham's argument was as follows. The people of Sodom, you think that they should have learned from me? I'm a nobody. Why should they learn from me? In other words, if I was an important person within society, and I was a public figure that was really well known and well respected and well regarded, Hashem, so then I could understand that you have a taina, you have a complaint against the people of Sodom that they're not learning from me. But Avraham's point was, Va'anochi afar va'efer, but I'm a nobody. So you can't really blame the people of Sodom from not learning from me. He says, therefore, Aval anochi afar va'efer, mi anochi sheyilmad ish mimeni, v'chi ani hashafal ke'afar va'efer, eheye le'inayim la'acherim. Why should therefore I be a lesson for others? Al kain ein laha'ashimam al zeh. and therefore, God, you should not hold them liable. I want to use this kernel of a thought from the Chassam Sofer to develop another idea. Maybe I'll talk a little bit more. First, present to you something from an article, After the Forest Fire Benefits to Plants. This is just from a website that talks about how ash can actually be beneficial for the growth of new plants. Despite the damage that can occur to property and people, good things can come out of forest fires too. Forest fires are a natural and necessary part of the ecosystem. Even healthy forests contain dead trees and decaying plant matter. When a fire turns them to ashes, nutrients return to the soil instead of remaining captive in old vegetation. And when fire rages through dry underbrush, it clears thick growth so sunlight can reach the forest floor and encourage the growth of native species. Fire frees these plants from the competition delivered by invasive weeds and eliminates diseases or droves of insects that may have been causing damage to old growth. Wildflowers begin to bloom abundantly. Most young, healthy trees are resilient enough to survive a forest fire and will soon have a growth spurt thanks to flames that thin light-banning canopies above. And scientists report young growth forests recovering from fire are home to more diverse species in both plants and animals. This is because the remnants of burned trees offer attractive habitats to birds and small mammals, and nutrients from burned vegetation continue to leach into the soil to fuel the birth of new plants. That's what ash does. And that's what really soil is. Soil is the way that things grow. I'd like to suggest, just as a possibility, that what was of great concern, and just imagine Avraham in the face of what the Chassam Sofer has just taught us. He's thinking to himself, God is telling me he's going to destroy the people of Sodom. And perhaps it's my fault that God is going to destroy the people of Sodom. If I wasn't their neighbor, then perhaps they would not be as blameworthy. But the fact that I live right near Sodom and I'm doing the antithesis of what Sodom represents, and they have the ability to learn from me, and they don't, Avram must have been mortified. I'm trying to make the world a better place. I'm trying to bring life to humanity and give people a sense of purpose and meaning. And now look what's happening because of me, is that a whole city-state is being destroyed by Hashem because of me, because of my actions, and my behavior is casting aspersions on an entire population of people. No one would want to be in that position, no matter how righteous they are, right? And so when you think about it in that way, I think perhaps what Avraham was stating when he was sort of almost lodging a complaint against God. I am Afar and Afer. Hashem, I view my role as being the catalyst for growth, as being the catalyst for new life, as being able to share with the world the message of goodness and what the purpose of life is. How can it be that through me, there's going to be death and destruction? And if you take that into its context, then we understand how these mitzvot of the Parah Aduma and the Sota are very much connected to Avraham's declaration of himself being Afar va'efer. I've always viewed myself just as the catalyst to get people's natural goodness to get going. In other words, I don't have any magical powers. I can't transform people from whom they are, but I can be an influence of good. I can help people, just like ash helps a burned down forest, and just like the earth around a seed provides it with its nutrients to be able to grow. That's all I am, and therefore Hashem. So Hashem looks at this attitude of Avraham. He says that's what it means to be a Jew, to be the catalyst of rebirth and growth, especially after negative things have occurred. And if that's the case, then really that's what the ashes of the Parah Aduma represent. They represent a regrowth from something that previously was dead. Yes, from death and destruction can come new life. And that's what the ash of the Parah Aduma represents. It's also when a marriage is on the rocks and a couple are having difficulty with their relationship to the point where a woman now starts to develop an emotional relationship with another man. And that's really what the Sota story is all about. It's not that she's necessarily guilty of adultery in the physical sense, but she's at least shown that she's guilty of developing a deep emotional connection to another man who's not her husband. And there the Torah says that has to be rectified. Take the earth from the ground that can help regenerate and rebuild a seedling that is just now needs to be replanted. And there needs to be regrowth. And that's the influence that of an Avraham Avinu who's just trying to make the world a better place by fostering new life, even when there was harm and scarring and damage previously. That's what the earth of the Sota procedure represents as well, right? Try to regerminate the seed that we know is still there, even though there's been tremendous damage to the foliage of that marriage. Let's try to regerminate and regrow. Okay, that's what the Sota procedure represents, just very much like what the Parah Aduma ash is representing as well. And the reason why my focus and my thoughts are on this right now is because I can't shake that image of the burnt out home that I stood in front of in one of the shuvim. It was in Kisufim, where I stood just last week. Just last week, I was in Kisufim, which is a moshav right outside of Gaza. One of those, we were in Kfar Aza, and we were in our last trip, and now I was in Kisufim, and the head of the fire brigade of the village of Kisufim is a guy named Dani Gerkovich, and he stood in front of us. He spoke to us with his fire brigade uniform and told us the story of his daughter who used to live in that house, that burnt out house. And she was burnt to death with her husband before they could even build a family. They were killed by Hamas. They were murdered by Hamas in their home. And he said, my job is to put out fires, and I couldn't put out the fire that killed my daughter. And the strength that this man had to be able to stand in front of us and tell us his story was just so powerful. It was such a difficult moment for all of us. And I had the zechus to say Kaddish with him in front of his daughter's home. But his message to us was we have to focus on life, on rebuilding, and on making sure that this never happens again. And yeah, but that's the point. The point I'm trying to raise is that take the ash of destruction and use it to rebuild. And something positive is going to come from all of this death and destruction. We have to believe that. And it's that confidence that Avraham has in the future, that calling himself Afer and Afer, that I know that things could be bad, but I do believe that things can be repaired. Even when they've been reduced to dirt and ashes, I believe that something good and positive can grow, even from something that happens in Sodom. And that's the reason why he kept fighting and kept struggling for better life. So that's what I'm taking from here. That from death comes life. That's the Parah Aduma. From ash comes life, and from the dirt of the Sota From a damaged marriage, a damaged relationship, comes reconciliation and new growth. And we have to be confident in that. And that's part of the optimism of what it means to be a Jew. And that's what I think what we should be taking with us when we read the passage of the Parah this Shabbos. So those are my thoughts. Let's see. There's a comment from, Michelle's going back to the clairvoyant story, talking about Chinese medicine and talking about the potential dangers of that. Yeah. Okay. Anyone want to share anything about the ashes of the Parah Aduma? Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Have a wonderful week. And a
Thank you.
Hashem. I'm not going anywhere until at least after Pesach. So
Okay.
hope to see you all next week. Good question. Let me look at the calendar. I'll let you know. Okay. All right. Take care, everybody. See you soon.